collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambos.
Coming up this week, we'll hear about the significance of the Magna Carta.
It was Magna Carta that tied the king's hands from, for example, exacting forced loans.
Discuss best practices in combating human trafficking.
In a lot of countries you see increased numbers with regard to child trafficking, for example, specifically with regard to begging and petty crimes.
And what effect is the huge influx of refugees having on smuggling and human trafficking in Turkey?
Now that there are more than 2 million Syrians in Turkey without any means of survival, it is impossible that they are not trafficked. Some of them are not trafficked.
On a lighter note, it's the Pharos Contemporary Music Festival.
This year we have a Dutch ensemble, percussion Dutch ensemble, who are very experienced in using all sorts of materials in the performances and objects.
This year, the UK is celebrating the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta. To celebrate this event, the British High Commission in Nicosia hosted an event on Monday with a guest from the UK. He is Mr. Desmond Browne QC, Treasurer of Gray's Inn and former Chairman of the Bar of England. Desmond, you gave a fascinating talk because you're obviously, as well as a lawyer, a historian. But do tell us a little bit about why the Magna Carta has passed through 800 years to still be considered an important document.
Well, as I said in my talk, if you actually look at Magna Carta, its contents are surprisingly few in relation to those rights that we now think of as the rule of law. But what Magna Carta did do was to establish that the king was not an absolute ruler, and the barons did that. It was not in any way a democratic document. In the main, it conferred rights and privileges on the barons. But, as has been said, for about 400 years after 1215, people really forgot about Magna Carta. Shakespeare didn't mention it when he wrote his play King John. But it came back into focus when Parliament was struggling with the king in the 1620s. And at that time, Sir Edward Coke was at great pains to make it clear to the king with the so-called Petition of Right that it was Magna Carta that tied the king's hands from, for example, exacting forced loans.
So we're under a bit of a misapprehension that this is, in a sense, the basics of democracy in much of the world?
Well, we're not under a misapprehension because, to a great extent, the principle it laid down was that the king was not absolute, that he was not an autocrat. And we owe thanks to the barons for that, even though in some respects Magna Carta was a self-interested document for them.
But what about, if you like, the serfs and the lower classes? Didn't really have their interests at heart, did it? Where did that come from with the sort of law that we have now underpinning most Western democratic countries?
Well, that came partly from the Petition of Right in 1628. And of course, also, so far as the United States is concerned, from the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And they all harked back to what they believed was contained in Magna Carta, rather than what actually was contained in Magna Carta.
But it has had an impact, therefore, on the legal groundwork of probably half the world's countries.
Undoubtedly, because it's often referred to by people who believe they know what it says, but if you look at the Magna Carta you'd be surprised. As I said in my talk, there are references there to fish traps in inland rivers being banned. There are references to a ban on forced remarriage of widows. The head of the Court of Appeal, when he spoke at Runnymede in June of this year referred to it as a hodgepodge, and it is a hodgepodge.
But most legal things probably start out that way, don't they?
Well, they do, and gradually, based on what happens and on what people think about a particular statute, things develop and expand. And Magna Carta is still the key provisions of Magna Carta in relation to fair trial, impartial court, speedy justice, are all still part of English law. Those three critical articles, 39 and 40 in the Charter.
As a lawyer, would you think that it may be time for us to enact another Magna Carta for the modern era? Can it be improved upon, or have we done that over the 800 years with new legislation bit by bit?
I think we've done it. We've all done it in Europe. In 1948 was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, called by Eleanor Roosevelt a modern Magna Carta, and it was shortly after that that a number of European nations set to work to draft the European Charter on Human Rights. And in Cyprus, much of the interpretation of that is owed to the work of your Justice Loukis Loukaides. I mean, nobody has been more independent-minded in his approach to the European Convention than him. So I don't think we need a new Magna Carta. We've got today the Magna Carta rights contained in the European Convention. And one only has to see the relevance of it in the context of the recent case over your Deputy Attorney General, because he relied on his rights of freedom of expression to justify what he'd done.
Just before we finish, you're going to be talking, while you're here in Cyprus, on the current state of the law of defamation, and that's following the 1996 and 2013 statutory reforms. That, of course, involves media very much, and they've been much in the headlines recently for their coverage of certain things. What, basically, very quickly, will you be saying up there?
Well, what I'll be saying is that the unreformed common law of defamation was perhaps tilted too much in favour of claimants. Whether it was or was not, that was certainly the belief which triggered the 2013 Act. The 2013 Act has now made it much harder for claimants to sue in England by requiring them to establish that they have suffered serious harm to their reputation. And if they can't do that, now they can't sue. There's no longer a presumption that they've suffered damage.
Desmond Browne QC, thanks very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambos.
Brigitte Stevkovsky is from the International Centre for Migration Policy Development in Austria. She was one of the keynote speakers at a conference held earlier this week on international best practices in combating human trafficking. She spoke particularly about the transnational referral mechanism, and I asked her what that entailed.
Well, a transnational referral mechanism, the ultimate purpose is actually to make sure that victims of trafficking receive efficient assistance according to their needs. So what it means is that all the anti-trafficking stakeholders involved in victim referral know what they have to do, when they have to do it, and how. And they also know what their responsibility is within victim referral.
But transnational means that you're operating across national borders, and that must complicate issues tremendously.
Yes, exactly. So actually it covers both levels. At the national level, of course, also all actors need to cooperate accordingly, and then also at the transnational level, ideally, of course.
So how do you actually implement that? I mean, you've presumably got groups in all the countries you cooperate with, but I'm equally sure there are countries that don't even have a referral mechanism or the infrastructure in place to give victims of trafficking support.
Exactly. I mean, as I said also during the conference, we are project-based, meaning we rely on external funding, so whatever we do takes place in the framework of projects or programs. So it's a long process. In the case of Southeastern Europe, it took us 6 years. We had so-called project implementation teams in each country. These were groups of people from different agencies, usually one representative from an NGO, one police person, prosecutor, sometimes also Ministry of Foreign Affairs was involved, and so forth. And countries got involved in the long process of setting up this system.
And what impact has it had in terms of results of the identification, particularly of victims of human trafficking? Some of the figures that were mentioned at the conference this morning were quite horrifying when it came to single-figure cases of successful prosecutions, when we know that the problem is huge.
Yes, it's very difficult, of course, to draw conclusions based on the figures we have, because, of course, also the data we have is not really reliable. And then it's very difficult to say whether our project or the guidelines we developed, the referral mechanism, has actually a direct impact on the figures we get. But what we can say is we asked the stakeholders after 6 years of implementation what their opinion was, and the feedback we got was definitely that it was much easier to get in contact with anti-trafficking stakeholders in the other countries that participated in the program, that they received information which they didn't get before. So in general, it makes cooperation much easier and direct, without any intermediary organizations or agencies.
So what else needs to be done, do you think, to improve not only the cross-border cooperation, because of course trafficking is very much a cross-border operation. What needs to be done to improve not only the reception and prosecution mechanisms, but also the support for the victims?
Yeah, I mean, in general also it's a whole package that you need to think of. So it's a lot also about capacity building, of course, constant training, making sure people are involved, and very important, make sure that knowledge is shared. You know, there is a lot of staff turnover usually in the countries I work with, and then the problem is one person leaves and the knowledge is not handed over. So this is a big gap. And with regard to assistance, of course, in a lot of countries this is done by NGOs that again rely on external funding. So, of course, it's also important to ensure that government supports also these NGOs, also in terms of funding and everything.
It's not really satisfactory, is it, that the majority of the work is actually carried out by non-governmental organisations? Shouldn't the governments of all these countries have mechanisms and infrastructure in place to take the overall responsibility and make sure that it's implemented?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, ideally it's a cooperation of the different sectors. Multi-agency cooperation is definitely the best practice according to my experience. It varies from country to country. In some countries also the government relies on the support of NGO shelters just because they think they know best how to do it, and then they sign a cooperation agreement with them. They provide funding for the NGOs, and they are very happy with this system, for example, just because NGOs have the relevant know-how.
And most importantly, I guess, when you look at the figures for the years you've been working in, are you detecting any trends? Is it having an impact? Are the numbers of trafficked people reducing?
Well, we don't know, because what we see is just the victims that have been identified. So actually we really don't know, because it could mean that the response is better because more people get identified, but it could also mean there are more victims of trafficking. You can never be sure. It's very difficult to deal with figures when it comes to trafficking in human beings, because it's a crime. It's a very complex crime. And most of it is just hidden. We don't know really about it. Trends, of course, forms of trafficking are changing, but again, we are not sure if they are changing or if just the reporting has changed, if people are able to identify more forms of trafficking in human beings. But definitely you will see an increase in trafficking for labor exploitation, which we presume is related to the fact that practitioners, police mainly, know now better how to identify these cases. Also, in a lot of countries you see increased numbers with regard to child trafficking, for example, specifically with regard to begging and petty crimes.
That is Brigitte Stevkovsky from the International Centre for Migration Policy Development, who was one of the keynote speakers at the PRIO Cyprus Centre's Conference on International Best Practices in Combating Human Trafficking.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Tuba Dündar joins us now from the Human Resource Development Foundation in Turkey. Tuba, Turkey at the moment, of course, on the front line in a way with the migrants from the Syrian area and the Middle East and other people coming from further afield through Syria to Turkey. How many millions have you got at the moment in Turkey? And can you give us any indication? I know it's not your field in terms of trafficking, but can you give us any indication of how this is impacting upon the work that NGOs in Turkey are doing?
Yeah, you're right. I am working in an anti-trafficking program, and Syrians are a new phenomenon in Turkey. There are no official statistics regarding how many Syrians are now in Turkey, and the numbers are changing, of course, but it is said that it is more than 2 million Syrians, women, men, many children in Turkey. Some of them are in camps, as you know maybe, but the majority are scattered in big provinces.
And are they staying there? A lot of them, of course, are taking those boats to try and get to Greece and the European Union.
Yeah.
Now, before we started chatting, we were discussing this, and you pointed out that that's people smuggling, it's not people trafficking.
Yeah.
I think I know what the difference is, but just you're the expert, explain it.
Human smuggling, or migrant smuggling it is called, it is just what happens to the Syrians. These smugglers take money to transport migrants from one country to the other. It is different from the trafficking because it doesn't, in quotation, involve exploitation of any type of labor of the migrants.
In other words, when they land wherever they land, they're free people to do what they want to do.
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes I cannot help but think that if this is a good smuggler, he is saving the lives of some of the migrants, you know. If he's making something happen, if he takes one migrant from this country and places the family to another country that he has promised, then it's a good thing. But there is no such thing in trafficking. Traffickers are the persons who exploit the labor of a migrant, or it doesn't have to be a migrant, a person in any type of work, in prostitution, in domestic work, in agriculture, everywhere. So in fact, there are two different types of business, in quotation, two different types of crime. And of course, some smugglers can become traffickers. It's a fact. Or they can exploit this smuggling situation. This is like the rumors, but we hear people are smuggled, let's say, into Turkey, and that, I'm not talking about Syrians now, and that relationship should end at that point, but then they keep the people locked and want money from the families to release the migrants. So this is something else. But if we go back to our first issue, smuggling is something, trafficking is something else. Syrians are, of course, using smugglers to reach European Union countries now.
But do you think that, I mean, because although there is that sort of difference about what happens at the end of the journey, particularly if it's a cross-border journey, but basically I'm wondering whether or not this huge influx of people in desperate need is, in a sense, providing a cover for the traffickers because eyes are turned elsewhere. When will you be able to find out whether or not, in fact, trafficking has increased? Because trafficked people tend to be vulnerable people.
Yeah,
of course, the majority, particularly of the underage, unaccompanied people fleeing Syria, are very vulnerable.
Of course, you're right. This is a known fact that there are many victims in refugee communities, not only in Syrian communities but in other communities as well. Now that there are more than 2 million Syrians in Turkey without any means of survival, it is like impossible that they are not trafficked. Some of them are not trafficked. But trafficking is such a sometimes difficult to define phenomenon. Because as I was saying, now sometimes we hear that young Syrian women are married to older Turkish men, sometimes as second wives, and probably these men are paying money to the families of these young women. Then in fact this is trafficking, because they are buying the labor, domestic labor, let's say, the sex of these women, and they are paying money to the family generally, or I don't know, maybe there are mediators. So we hear that there are these types of marriages. Also, of course, we hear that children or adults work in sweatshops in several places, earning very, very small amounts of money. But then, of course, this is not trafficking. If there is a consent, this is not trafficking. But then when you think of children, then you cannot say that there is a consent because they're children. Then it is trafficking. So it's a little bit complicated.
And that is Tuba Dündar from the Human Resource Development Foundation in Turkey.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambos.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
Music lovers in Cyprus are, of course, familiar with the Pharos Arts Foundation. It organises music festivals and concerts throughout the year. But at this time of year, it's always the turn of contemporary music. And coming up, starting tonight and running till the 11th of October, is the 7th International Pharos Contemporary Music Festival. The artistic director of the festival is Evis Samoutis, who joins us now. Evis, it's something that I think actually Pharos, it's fair to say, has brought to the audience in Cyprus, because contemporary music is a little risky if you're trying to sell tickets, but he seems to have turned that round.
Yes, Pharos is somehow a pioneer in many ways when it comes to artistic events in Cyprus, not only through the Chamber Music Festival that is going strong, but also through the Contemporary Music Festival that is continuing this year. The problem with contemporary music is global, it's not just localized, but I think that after a few editions of the festival, we have enough experience now to be able to connect more meaningfully with the audience here in Cyprus, understanding the vernacular differences, if you like, between the Cyprus music scene and the European music scene, and be able to offer something to people that can be meaningful but also intellectual.
How do you go about, as an artistic director of the festival, choosing what to put in there and what will, in a sense, attract the audiences in Cyprus?
It's a rather complex decision-making and process. I'm very fortunate to have the support of Yvonne Georgiadou and also Garo Keheyan, the president of the foundation, in determining, identifying, if you like, who the right artists are for each festival, and then also working with them to devise a program. In many instances, it's also an idea we have about a particular collaboration or a cross-disciplinary collaboration with other art forms. So, for example, last year we had the music for silent films with Ergon Ensemble, and this year we have a Dutch ensemble, percussion Dutch ensemble, who are very experienced in using all sorts of materials in their performances and objects. So sometimes it's the ensemble that triggers a particular theme, sometimes it's the theme, and then it's us trying to find the right people to materialize a vision.
So how many concerts in all this year for the 7th Festival?
This year we have 4 concerts, and between the concerts we have various educational workshops, screenings and lectures, and we have groups from Holland, Belgium, the UK, and the solos from the UK as well.
And tell me a bit about the workshops and so on, because you are reaching out as well to young children. Are they open to contemporary music?
Yes, absolutely. We're really open and really keen to expand educational activities. And I have to say that most of the times children and young adults are much more open to new things, to new experiences than adults are. They haven't formed their preferences yet. They're open to new ideas and they seem to enjoy it a lot. We're also very fortunate to have really talented educators coming to our festival. For example, Peter Shepard-Skervert, one of the foundation's most close collaborators, if you like, over the last few years, has a huge track record of working with children across the globe very effectively.
So what sort of thing goes on in these workshops?
These workshops vary according to what the program is and what the group's coming from culture really is. So, for example, for today's workshop with the Dutch group, we have a very unique situation where kids were told that they could bring any utensil from the house that they would like, or any other object. The purpose of the workshop is then to work with the percussionist in transforming, if you like, those everyday objects into musical instruments. On Peter Shepard-Skervert's workshop, we're going to have a fascinating discussion between the past, the present, the future, in discussing works of the classical repertoire, such as the Brahms horn trio, with newer cutting-edge works. And in the head collectives, the ensemble from Belgium workshop, we will have a fascinating return to time to Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony, one of the unsung masterpieces, if you like, of the 20th century repertoire, which incidentally receives the Cyprus premiere. So it's a big variety there between the 3 workshops, and I think there's something for all to enjoy and learn.
And the concerts are taking place where?
Well, the concerts are taking place at the Shoe Factory in Moore Street, and we'll have concerts on the 2nd, 4th, 6th, and then the 11th.
That is the 7th International Pharos Contemporary Music Festival, and you can find all the details at the Pharos Arts Foundation website. You can also call 22663871. The website, www.pharosartsfoundation.org. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.